So we left off in land use controls, and as I said, this is kind of like the last section, um, more or less, of this grouping of slides. And so, land use controls differ from a lot of the other things I've taught you thus far because while there is a lot of language and there is, a lot to it, they are arguably a little bit more straightforward, right? It's just understanding this divide between public land use controls and private land use controls. And of course, public land use controls is the government controlling things for the betterment of the municipality, right? The county, the township, the city, whatever it may be. And that's where, they can be enforced with police power. And so that's where we're currently in, is these public land use controls. So once we wrap up these public ones, we'll move into the private a little bit more. So we started talking about some of the different language that comes into this, right? Like when you are in compliance with the zoning, we call that a conforming use. When you are not in compliance with the zoning, we call that a non-conforming use generically. But a non-conforming use could be both what we said, legal or illegal. And what was the key thing that made it a legal non-conforming use? What had to happen for a non-conforming use to be legal?
It had to be prior to the situation.
Yeah. Grandfathered in prior to a rezoning change, right? So you built a building that was in compliance with the zoning, and then for whatever reason, the municipality decided to rezone that area. When they rezoned it, it included yours, and now your property is no longer in compliance with this rezoned area, but they're not going to make you stop. And so that's what we called a legal non-conforming use, grandfathered in. I told you, in theory, it could go indefinitely, but they typically do want you to come into compliance, and so that's where they may turn down permits to expand, rebuild, renovate, things of that nature. Typically, you're limited to just let it continue existing until it can't anymore, and then we'll eventually want you to conform to the new zoning. And then, of course, the illegal non-conforming use is you just blatantly disregarded what the zoning was. So purchased a property that was zoned residential, built a commercial building. That would be an illegal non-conforming use. Now be very careful because you will get test questions. It says something along the lines of such and such is operating, a commercial building in a residential property, and he sells it to somebody else. What would be the best definition of this property? Don't you pick that it's now a legal non-conforming use, because it's not. If it was an illegal use and then it was sold to somebody, it's still an illegal use. Grandfathered in does not mean you got to sell it at one point. That is not it. So just be very careful there. Some of the other language we talked about that I told you to be very careful of were things like a variance. A variance is where you asked to basically ignore a rule or two within the ordinances. They didn't change the zoning. They didn't change the rules, but they basically gave you permission to ignore a rule or two due to some undue hardship that was no fault of your own. Not common for them to approve them, but it is something they can approve. Please make sure that you do not confuse that with a rezoning. When you're dealing with, this area is agricultural residential, this area is agricultural residential, and I want to build, an industrial manufacturing plant. Well, the companies that are trying to build that, they would have to go to the planning board and they would have to petition to have it rezoned. And because they're investing so much money into the economy, they typically can get that pushed through in a lot of respects. Bridge, I see your message in the chat. So you're saying grandfathering doesn't apply to the new owner. Understand what I'm saying. I'm saying that if we are talking about selling an illegal use to somebody, it's still an illegal use. If we're talking about a legal non-conforming use, yeah, there are sometimes permissions to sell the business as long as it's being sold exactly as it is. And that grandfathering in would apply to the new owner. Now, do understand that sometimes in municipalities will say that you can't sell it. So that's kind of like on a case-by-case basis. And so it may or may not apply to the new owner. But the legal one typically does apply to the new owner if it can be sold per the ordinances of the municipality. Yep, for sure. So we talked about some others, right? Overlay district. What did we say an overlay district was? Additional zoning restrictions specific to an area. What do you mean by additional? I'm trying to get like another word out of you. Like,
it's on top of the current zoning.
There you go. Additional zoning restrictions on top of already existing zoning. There you go. Not property, right? But so what we gave examples of residential zoning, like maybe an R2, but maybe a flood architectural zoning where it had to meet certain criteria of stilts or wind resistance or something like that. So you've got two different sets of zoning overlapping each other. That's an overlay district. One of the other examples I gave you was the historic preservation zoning in maybe a residential area. So maybe it's be zoned residential, but there may also be historic preservation zoning due to the historic nature. And so that's what historic preservation zoning was well, hey, because of the historic nature of these homes, if you own a home here, it has to be repaired to certain, historical authenticity. You can't level it. You can't modernize it. You have to, kind of maintain the historic aspect of it. And so that would be an example. Of course, then the last ones that we left off on before where we were aesthetic zoning and spot zoning. Remember, we said aesthetic zoning, very common in certain areas where they want everything to fit a certain aesthetic, as the name implies, by having certain design features, certain colors, certain build materials. Could happen in high-end areas, can happen in tourist areas, could happen in even, less specific areas than that, but that is a very common thing. And then I told you, spot zoning is where they've rezoned an itty-bitty little piece, which is not common for rezoning in any way, shape, or form. Not automatically illegal, but if it's not done, arguably for the betterment of the public interest, then it's typically going to be considered illegal and can be overturned in the courts because somebody paid somebody to do it. And so here's where we left off last night, was with cluster zoning and the buffer zone. And of course, we talked about those. Cluster zoning is just where the properties have, smaller lot sizes, which means they can be closer together, and that maximizes open space or green space in either the community or the subdivision. Cul-de-sacs, townhouses, things of that nature would be a prime example of cluster zoning versus properties where everybody has, 20-acre plats all over the place. And then a buffer zone just breaks up two different sets of zoning, right? Commercial easing into residential, industrial easing into commercial. It could be a greenway, could be a park, could be a forest, could be something like that. But it's just designed to kind of break it between two different types of zoning that kind of contrast a little bit more. So here's where we get into the other little aspect of these public land use control discussions. And as I said, there's just a lot of vocab. None of it's especially crazy in any way, shape, or form, but it's flashcards. Make sure you kind of look over it. When we're dealing with zoning, you've already figured out, because I told you about rezoning, that sometimes the government will decide to change what the zoning is, right? Like, it's currently residential, but we're going to rezone it to commercial. And that's where I told you those public hearings come into play, and the public is allowed to speak their piece. But there is what we call pending, potential, and confirmed when we're talking about changing zoning. Potential means they're discussing it, and it hasn't gone to an actual hearing or vote yet. Pending means there's a deadline. It's been voted on, right? It's going to probably happen. And then confirmed is it's happening. It's happened. It's something like that. But here's the key takeaway, folks. And this is where I'm going to introduce a very important concept in the real estate world. Whether a zoning is potentially changing, is changed, is being discussed about changing, whatever it may be, these are all material facts. And so a material fact, the easiest way to think about it is information that, if known, could change the outlook of a party in completing a transaction. And real estate brokers always have an obligation to disclose material facts. So prime example, if somebody was interested in a piece of property that was zoned residential and they wanted to build a house on it, which is residential, but there was discussions of it being rezoned to commercial, isn't that something that could change the outlook of your party in wanting to buy it? Because there's a chance that before they even close on it, it may not be something they can build a house on anymore. So potentially changing, and discussions of changing, all of these things would be considered a material fact. Now, another big thing that comes into play when we're dealing with material facts and disclosures is what we would call street disclosures. Now, folks, whether a street is public or private. So if a street is public, that means that the Department of Transportation, the DOT, maintains it. So if there's damage to it, they will fix it with taxpayer dollars in 1 to 12 business years, or whenever they get to it, the DOT. If it's private, then it could be the individual property owner's responsibility to fix it. And so imagine living in a neighborhood, and this is not a far-fetched thing. This actually happened a lot in the 90s, where developers would build properties, develop subdivisions. They would not turn it over to the DOT. And then the roads would be private. They would not maintain. They need to be repaired. And then it fell on all the homeowners. And so what they basically do is when it gets repaired, you just take the total bill and you divide it by however many homeowners and what the road frontage they have in front of their house. And so you can get slapped with, $5, $10, $15, $20,000 special assessments because it's your private road and you've got to maintain it. So whether a street is public or private is also a material fact. And there are required disclosures for developers as well to tell us what their intention is. Now, as a point of clarity on these public versus private roads, folks, when a developer is building a subdivision, they will decide what their intention is. Do we intend to keep this as a private road? Do we intend to make this a public road? And if they intend to make it public, they have to build it to the DOT specifications. Certain thickness, certain width, certain amount for public right-of-way. And even after they do that, the subdivision has to hit a certain population density. There has to be a certain number of homeowners that move in, and they can fill out dedication paperwork. It's basically paperwork where they say, well, hey, we built these streets and we want you to have them, Department of Transportation. It's called dedication. But dedication does not automatically make it a public road. Not until the DOT has actually accepted them, aka adopted them, will they become public roads. And so even though you filled out the paperwork, they're still private up until the time the DOT takes them over. At which time, then it's the DOT's roads, and they will maintain them. Bill says, how are the zoning changes advertised? How does a broker research for disclosures? Unfortunately, it's not like we get like a monthly flyer as real estate brokers that like tell us of all these changes. And so what it typically entails is getting well versed with the local planning boards for the counties and the cities you do business with, and looking up the meeting minutes, which are public records, proposed projects, proposed zoning changes, things of that nature. It's just kind of being a little more well versed in your locale, if you will. Yeah. Now, this last note here, it says North Carolina Real Estate Commission and local governments working on internet database improvements to clearly define which roads are public versus private. I've had this on my slides for a while now. Full disclosure, it wasn't the Real Estate Commission so much as it was what they call RPAC. NCRPAC was the North Carolina Realtors Political Action Committee, basically lobbying campaigns for real estate professionals in North Carolina. And that was one of the things that they did was work towards getting a better database to discover whether roads were public or private. And it is better. Is it finite? Sure. Or no, but is it better? Yes. Now, here's one of the really oddly specific testable aspects from a North Carolina point of view with subdivision regulations. And I told you, be very careful, because subdivision regulations is a public land use control. 271 is the slide number. Subdivision regulations, in other words, let's switch that around, regulating the building of subdivisions. And so by definition in North Carolina, if you take a lot and you divide it into 2 or more lots with the intent to build, sell, or develop, it's considered a subdivision. Folks, it only takes 2 lots to be considered a subdivision. I know in your mind, you're probably like, oh, 100 lots. No. A subdivision only has to be 2 or more with the intent to build, sell, or develop, or any time that you make a new street. It falls under subdivision regulations. What does that mean? It means that if you own a big chunk of land that's 20 acres and you want to cut it into 2 chunks of 10 acres, you do not need to ask the government because it's just your personal land that you are just dividing. But if you buy a 5-acre parcel with the intent of turning it into a 5-acre parcel with a road in between, and you're going to be selling it to a builder, that is a subdivision. It only takes 2 lots to be determine this. And so that means that you would have to take your plans to the planning board and submit them for approval before you can legally start developing the subdivision. That's the regulation part. They get to say yay or nay. And so when you're dealing with this, you have a civil engineer and surveyor draw out the map of the proposed subdivision, any proposed roads, and all the features of it, and you submit that. That is what we call your preliminary plat submission. And it will go to a review, and it will go to a vote, and they will decide if you can do it or not. And once they say, yes, you can, that is what we call preliminary plat approval. The government said, yes, you can build this subdivision, and so you can. Now, here's the key piece you got to be careful of. This is the very testable part of this. Once you have received preliminary plat approval, you can start, obviously, then developing the property. But even more than that, you can contract on the lots that you're developing, and you can market them for sale. So if you get this, 5-lot map approved, right, where you got, a little cul-de-sac here, and it's 1, 2, 3, whatever that equates to. Yeah, 5 lots. You get this 5-lot plat approved. Now you could start advertising, hey, we have lots 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for sale. And if you were selling them to a builder, for example, a builder could contract to buy all 5 of those lots from you. But you cannot close on those lots. You cannot transfer title to those lots until the final plat map has been recorded. Why is this? Because preliminary says, we like your plans, they look great. Folks, when somebody comes in and starts developing, sometimes they find things like bedrock or limestone or things that don't allow them to build, or unsuitable soils for septics or things of that nature. And so they could change. So you cannot close on or transfer title to these lots until the final plat map has been recorded, meaning the project is done and you've recorded the final map saying this is what it looks like. Now, when we're talking about this, that means that if somebody was to contract on it after preliminary plat approval and it ends up changing from what they contracted on, they're allowed to get out of it with no penalties. You got to give them their money back. That's kind of a big thing there. What you got, Bree?
Does this apply to like family compounds as well, or is this just when you're selling to a developer, like a company?
It would potentially apply to family compounds as well if those compounds end up meeting 2 or more lots with the intention to build, develop, or sell. Now, if you own all of it yourself and you're not subdividing it and you're just building other houses on it and your ordinances say you can have multiple dwelling units on it, then no, wouldn't necessarily involve that. But if it meets the criteria of 2 or more lots with the intent to build, develop, or sell, it would. So I'm going to say it again. You would have to get permission from the government to build a subdivision if it falls into this criteria of 2 or more lots with the intent to build, develop, or sell, or anytime you make a new street. You can start advertising the lots and contracting on the lots, meaning having an agreement between them once you get preliminary plat approval, but you cannot close on or transfer title to these lots until the final plat map has been recorded. And that is recorded at the Register of Deeds with that plat map that we talked about in the legal descriptions, right? That lot and block method. Here's the map. Here's what it looks like. We're putting it in the public record. A couple more notes here. Because this is public land use controls, there would be criminal penalties for selling lots in an unapproved subdivision because you are in violation of actual law, right? Public land use controls, police power. So there are criminal penalties. And then, of course, you would also have to comply with the street disclosure laws. Disclose whether or not this subdivision is going to be maintain private roads or public roads. And remember, dedication versus acceptance. Even though your intention is for them to be public, they're not actually public until the DOT has adopted them. Now, this is where I want to just caution you on something, folks. Do not confuse this, which is a public land use control, with this that is a private land use control. If we say protective covenants, that is also restrictive covenants. And so that is private land use controls imposed by private property owners. Folks, the developer is the one who puts restrictive covenants on the lots. Why does the developer put restrictive covenants on the lots?
To make them more appealing for sale.
There you go. To maintain property values and make them more appealing for sale, because most people do not want to have a property where their neighbor can have 72 junk cars and 85 goats right next door, because that could be something that's a little detriment to their values. And so the private property owner, the developer who owns all the lots at one time, puts these rules on there, and those are imposed by private landowners for future private landowners. Private land use control, not public. Raphael, I'm not sure I understand the question. What's the relation of subdivision in Section 8? When you say Section 8, do you mean the Affordable Choice Housing, or the Housing Voucher Program? Housing Choice Voucher Program?
Yeah, that's what I heard the other day, and I was just trying to understand what it was, the Section 8, and then you explained about subdivision, so I was trying to figure this thing out. But I don't know, it might not even be related.
Well, there is zero relation directly between subdivision regulations and the Housing Choice Voucher Program, also called Section 8. Section 8 is basically government subsidized rent, if you will. It's basically if you meet certain financial criteria, hardships or otherwise, you could apply, and the government will pay a percentage of your rent. That's all Section 8 is. And so, it's been a big topic of conversation in recent years because nobody legally requires landlords to accept the housing choice vouchers, or in other words, Section 8. And so the question is, well, if a landlord's not accepting it, is that what we call disparate impact, which could fall under some protections under fair housing? But Section 8 is not something we need to get into for this class.
Thanks.
Yep, for sure. What you got, Tara?
I was just gonna say that Section 8 actually owns some subdivisions, so maybe you might have thought about that, because we take Section 8 where I do management at, but then there's some apartments around the corner, and they are all just for Section 8 people.
Yeah, I think there are big time partnerships and grants from that government division where you can basically partner, and if you build exclusive housing for that, then they're kind of exclusive for Section 8. That's exactly right. So, yeah, that is a thing. So we're going to talk about private land use controls in just a second. Just remember, okay, protective covenants, aka restrictive covenants, are a private land use control, but these subdivision regulations are a public land use control. And of course, as I mentioned already in my previous discussions, you can contract on and market these lots once they have preliminary plat approval. But you cannot close on or transfer title until the final plat map has been recorded. Also, this is where I told you that obviously you've got to explain to them what they're supposed to get and a copy of the plat and all the information. And if it changes materially in any way, shape, or form from what they contracted on prior to the final plat map being recorded, they are allowed to terminate with no penalties and get all their money back. And here is that part as well. Oh, I'm sorry, Tara. I didn't see your hand go back up.
Is there insurance for this at already put money into it previous to the closing of it, and then, you know, is there any insurance on it?
The person who's contracting on the lots? No, they just get all their money back. There's like, it's, you know, it's kind of like a deposit, but you would get it back because this has changed. And so they obviously the seller is not giving you what you were promised. So you don't need insurance. I mean, you just get everything back. Yeah. Here is another kind of miscellaneous concept that kind of comes into this section. Is this heavily testable? No, I honestly have never heard a student talk about seeing any questions on this right here. Not what I was just talking about. What I just talked about, I know is on the test, but this right here, it's something called the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. Okay. And so this deals with properties being marketed across state lines. It applies to sale or lease of most subdivisions containing 25 or more lots that are marketed across state lines. And so it's oddly specific, but I mean, of course, if you're somewhere like Charlotte, where, you know, you've got neighborhoods in North Carolina, but like South Carolina's right there, you may be marketing across them. And the reason why this comes into play is because every single state is a little bit different. Zoning is different. Disclosure laws are different. Brokerage laws are different. And so this is just additional protections for if maybe you're dealing with a house in an area you're not as familiar with. So it just requires certain disclosures to be present and or given to somebody and have an additional rescission period as well. So when they're dealing with purchasing a property that is bound by the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, 7-day rescission period after contract where they can get out of it if, you know, they find something that they weren't really privy to. And when I tell you that, you know, there's additional information, soil suitabilities, what kind of waste disposal system, septic versus sewer, how many homes are currently occupied, you know, amenities, distance of paved roads to nearby communities, things of that nature, right? Just a couple quirky additional things. I mean, obviously, we want people to have all the information anytime they're buying a house, but this just has some oddly specific things that they're supposed to be given. What you got, Brooks?
So when you say things that have to be, that are material fact that need to be disclosed, you're probably going to cover this at some of the time, but would crimes that happened in the home be a material fact?
No. Not in North Carolina.
So somebody got murdered in the house. It's not up to the real estate agent to disclose that by law.
Nope.
That's crazy.
That is crazy, yeah.
If
Some,
asked, can they tell them?
if asked, yes, they can tell you, but they can also say it's not a material fact and I don't wish to discuss it with you. They're not legally, if you ask them, they're not legally, it's not like, you know, Rumpelstiltskin where you guess his name and something like, right? Like we could say, we're not going to talk about it. We're going to get into that in great detail though. And I will tell you some states do require it. North Carolina does not. I'll tell you a funny, remind me when we get to that section, I'll tell you a funny story. I'm not going to derail for it right now, but I'll tell you a funny story when we get to that section, which will probably be, it might be tomorrow night. What you got, Raphael?
Just does the law of real estate varies a lot between state to state?
Yeah. I mean, a lot is such a subjective term. From my point of view as an educator, I would say yes.
Yeah, because I was reading a while back a couple of residents in a certain area in Manhattan. They were in agreement of a sale of one of those projects, and they ended up collecting like millions of dollars, and then leaving for free in the new development, just because they didn't want to move out.
Yeah, there's a bunch of, let's just put it this way, there's a bunch of really stupid laws that are designed in a really poor way that if somebody knows the loopholes, it can be a really big pain in the butt, right? Yeah. Yeah, it happens a lot.
Yeah, it's from that point that we're discussing now. If you reside in a place for more than X amount of months, and then people have a hard time to remove you from the property, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's a bunch of not to the same extent, but there was a story where somebody sold their house and for hundreds of thousands or $1 million or whatever, but they and I don't know how the buyer let this happen, but they didn't relinquish possession. So the buyer went to closing, they closed on the property, and when they went to go move in, the seller was still there and refused to leave, and they had to actually go through like a 4-month, 5-month, 6-month long process to evict them from the property because of the way the laws were written. So it's kind of stupid in a lot of states, and North Carolina has some stupid too, for sure.
California also, there was this lady who actually was, I think the property owner were renting Airbnb or one of those platforms, and then this lady extended her stay for over a month, so that would be considered like a long term. Then she stopped paying. The guy took forever. It took just forever for him to get rid of her.
Oh yeah, there's a bunch. There is an absolute. Now obviously none of that's testable in any way, shape, or form, but there is never a dull day in real estate, and there is some very stupid laws out there that people will leverage to their advantage and be scumbags. Happens all the time. Yeah. So the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, like I said, 25 or more lots being marketed across state property, 7-day rescission period, and then they just have to get some supplemental information to the consumer. And as I stated, that includes soil conditions, dealing with septics and foundations, of course, any existence of liens, type of title the buyer is going to receive, distance over paved roads to nearby communities, and the number of homes in the community currently occupied. Just some supplemental information, but these are not atypical things for us to disclose anyway. But it's just dealing with marketing across state lines. And like I said, not a very testable subject in any way, shape, or form to the best of my knowledge. So the last big piece of we're still in public land use control discussions, is building codes. Okay? Building codes. Public land use control, but it's very different from zoning and ordinances and things of that nature, right? While they're both public land use controls, one says what you can and can't build, zoning and ordinances, and the building codes state how you have to build them. So these building codes are what we call minimum construction standards for safety. That's why building codes exist. So if you've ever watched any, of course, HGTV or home improvement, shows or things like that, or if you're familiar and you've worked in it, you will always hear people saying things like studs have to be 16 inches on center, and the rise of stairs have to be like a certain rise and run, and things of that nature, certain insulation, certain this, certain that. These are all building codes. And you can definitely build it more, right? If you wanted to put a stud every 12 inches, you do you, boo-boo. Nobody's going to deny that. It gets expensive. But these are minimum construction standards for safety is the primary piece. And so what happens is when you're building a house, you got to submit a permit to build it. And, of course, tell them what you're building, where it's going to be, all the different features. And then the town or county inspector will come out, and they will check it every step of the way to make sure that the footers are the depth they need to be for the foundation, that the framing is where it needs to be, that the rough ends are done correctly, the insulation is done correctly. And they're supposed to come and check every big phase and sign off on it to make sure it's meeting these building codes. And at the final walkthrough, right, they're signing off that everything has gone through the permitting process and that they have all met building codes. And then and only then will they issue what they call the CO. You've probably heard that term before. It is the Certificate of Occupancy. In other words, that it has been signed off by the building inspector and it is safe for human occupancy. That is the CO. Now, when we're dealing with unpermitted space, folks, please understand that if you submit a permit to build a house, you're going to need to get it checked off every step of the way. However, people will very often have like unfinished attics and things of that nature that they will just take it upon themselves and they will finish it off. You're supposed to get that permitted as well because it's also still supposed to meet those same codes. So you're supposed to pull a permit and get it signed off. So if you do it without pulling a permit, it's a material fact that has to be disclosed. That this space was unpermitted, that you never confirmed that it was being built to correct codes. So as I said, building codes are a public land use control. But when it comes to like building codes versus zoning, they're both fruits, right? They're both public, but apples versus oranges, right? One's for safety, one's for what we do or don't want to see build there. Bridge says, where would you go to discover if an unfinished attic is unpermitted? You mean a finished attic? Like somebody, yeah. Here's the way that you can do it, and it's not a surefire way, but the thing is, if you go look at the tax appraisal card that says how many heated square feet you have, and that's different than what the house actually has, that's a very good indicator that a permit was never pulled, because most municipalities, once you submit a permit to finish building a space like an unfinished attic and finishing it, they will upgrade that so they can start taxing you on a larger square footage. Now, is that an absolute no? But that's one of those things in real estate we call a red flag, right? It's indicative that they probably didn't pull a permit if they're saying that, you know, it's this size, but the tax card says it's this size. Jack says permits are public records too on Raleigh.gov website. They are. Two detriments to that, though. Number one, if they didn't pull one, there's nothing to find. If they did pull one, then you can. The other thing is most municipalities do a terrible job of keeping anything past 7 years in like digital, format. So if you go and search, a lot of times they're expunged. Doesn't mean that you can't reach out to them. They may still have them in a file or a database somewhere. But you're absolutely right. They are public and you can hunt them down depending on the municipality and how thorough they are with record keeping and whether or not they were pulled.
Are general contractors allowed to finish a space that was supposed to be left unfinished without a permit?
No. Anytime you're changing structural, electrical, or plumbing, you're required to have a permit in just about every single municipality. And so finishing a space, changing square footage, that would typically always require a permit, even if you're a general contractor. No. So let's talk about something that kind of has two different locations, right? This is kind of in this section. It's also can kind of be grouped in environmental, depending on which way you slice it. So let's talk about a septic system. Folks, if you're not familiar with septics, a septic system is a on-site waste disposal system. If you are on sewer and septic are different. Sewer is when you flush your toilet, when water leaves your house, it gets pumped away and it goes to a water treatment plant. Septic, when you flush your toilet, when water leaves your house, it goes into a tank in your backyard. And so septic tanks are kind of interesting because what happens is everything in your house goes out an outlet pipe into this tank in your yard. And there's typically at least two sections in this. And so as things fill up on one side, there's a baffle wall that allow them to kind of filter over to the other side. And then there's another line that comes out of that side into what's called a distribution box. And that distribution box has a bunch of other lines that run through your yard called your leach field or drain field. And so when you have a septic, all wastewater that leaves your house goes into your yard. And it gets filtered through the soils, the sediments, the sands, and makes its way back into the natural aquifers. It filters it out. Arguably, the solids, I'll let you use your imagination as to what I'm talking about there, stay in the first one. And of course, they work just fine as long as you maintain them. Now, folks, I'm going to get on a little bit of a soapbox here because there are some people who need to hear this. Whether you have septic or sewer, the biggest thing you need to know about your existence is that neither septic nor sewer should you ever put anything like oils, fats, grease, or lotions down the drain ever. And you should never put wax down the drain. And you should never flush anything other than toilet paper. You are not supposed to flush anything other than that. I don't care if the package of wipes says flushable, they're not. You don't flush wipes, don't flush feminine stuff, don't flush nothing but toilet paper. And even aside from that, you're really not supposed to use like crazy amounts of bleach and chemicals because that can mess up your septic's natural bacteria concentrations and stuff like that. So that is true of both. No oils, fats, grease, nothing. Jack says, what if I put my old motor oil directly in the ground? That is actually environmental contamination. You don't want to do that either. Yeah. So here's the key things about a septic system, folks. It's a waste disposal system. Of course, there is, well, first things first. If we're dealing with septic permits, which is the amount of bedrooms a home is permitted for, you have to get a septic permit to build a septic tank on a property. You would go to, it's going to be testable as either the county health and environmental department. A lot of municipalities call the environmental health department, but health or environmental department would be who you go to for a septic permit. The other thing about septics is it is permitted for bedrooms, not bathrooms. So there's basically the way that it works. Folks, let me give you an example here. If you have a home with a septic tank, the permit may say, well, this is a 3-bedroom septic. And the reason why it's rated that way is because what they're basically stating is, well, if this house has double occupancy per bedroom, meaning 2 persons per bedroom, then it could probably keep up with 6 adults and it'd be fine. It's not based on toilets for the obvious reason. Folks, if you've got 17 toilets but 1 person living there, those toilets aren't getting a whole lot of use. The septic is not going to get a whole lot of use. If you've got 1 toilet and 82 people living there, that toilet and septic tank are getting a lot of use. So it's based on bedrooms, not bathrooms for that reason. And one of the big factors for us as real estate brokers is we can never advertise a home for more bedrooms than the septic permit allows for. So case in point, if we had a house, and mine's actually a prime example of this. My house that I live in North Carolina is over 3,000 square feet and there are 6 rooms. But it's on septic and it's a 3-bedroom septic permit. Which means that if I go to sell this house, I have to advertise it as a 3-bedroom, 3-bonus room house. I cannot call it anything more than a 3-bedroom. I could get creative and call it 3-bedroom, 1 bonus, 1 media room, 1 playroom. But I cannot call it more than a 3-bedroom house because the septic is not permitted for anything in excess of that. Septic permits. As I said, not all properties are on septic. Some are on sewer. Sewer doesn't have that same restriction because it's basically a pay per flush kind of thing versus septics, which are permitted for a certain number. What you got, Raphael?
Yeah, between the septic and the other one, which one has the risk of animals crawling in?
I mean, you're probably referring to septic because it's right there. And there's, of course, your septic tank risers and lines and stuff. It's not like a huge risk. I would say your bigger risk is roots growing into your septic and or into your drain lines and messing it up is going to be your bigger risk with septic. Animals not as common because it is still a cement tank and there is only certain ways you can get there.
Yeah, but you mean by roots? I thought it was some sort of a construction, done to prevent all that. Or
You're talking about the roots?
yeah, like you said that you probably have issues with roots and stuff like that in order to.
Well, you have to understand this about developers and builders. They're only going to clear what they have to under most circumstances. Unless it's easier and cheaper to clear cut everything, they'll only clear what they have to. And so to that point, what that means is, they may ignore a tree or 2 that are not far from the septic because they can still install it. And those roots will try to find that nutrient-rich water, and they will tie into it, and they can cause blockages, backups, and clogs, which can damage the systems. Yeah. What you got, Janet?
Okay, so now that you said that, like my instance, I have my septic on my backyard, and my husband is planning to plant some fruit trees. He has to go far away from the septic.
I would. Here's the thing: a lot of people make some very terrible mistakes where they will put decks and patios and all kinds of stuff too close or on. And the thing is, while it doesn't always mess up the functionality of it, if the system fails and you can no longer get to it, you're screwed, because now you're going to have to rip up your patio, you're going to have to rip up your deck, you're going to have to do all kinds of stuff like that. And so, especially trees, I wouldn't put a tree near the septic tank or the drain lines, because the roots do have a tendency to try to tie in, and they can cause damage to the drain lines. They can cause blockages. They can cause the cement to crack. They can cause a lot of issues. Yeah.
Is septic considered an encumbrance or no?
No.
So you have the option to use that or sewage?
No, it's one or the other. But I mean, it's just a waste disposal site. It's not considered an encumbrance. An encumbrance is a limitation. That you're quite the opposite of. You know what a limitation is? Having to poop in a bucket. So at least you can use a toilet, right? It's not an encumbrance. It's just it's a different type of system, but it is an approved waste disposal system.
But they would have to come out of pocket to maintain that, right?
Just like everything else in the house. Right? When you're a homeowner, you got to maintain it. Now, to that point, Bree, it's not expensive as long as you maintain it and it doesn't have any issues. The recommendation is to have it pumped and or inspected every 2 to 5 years, depending on frequency and how many people are living there. And, pumping typically costs $200 to $300, and inspection about the same. So it's not a crazy expense in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. Yeah, Bill says in Craven County, you must use county service available. Yeah, remember I told you the story about the Oak Island and the annexation. There are some municipalities that will annex you in and or force you to be on city sewer. But, for example, where I live in Willow Springs and a lot of Johnston County, they don't have the infrastructure available for city sewer. So septics are way more common in most of Johnston County, because there's just not enough water treatment plants. So they would have to spend billions to upgrade to that size where they could even offer sewer in most parts of Johnston County. So last couple things here on this on-site septic. Of course, I told you we can't advertise it for anything more than the number of bedrooms it's allotted for. Big thing there. And then straight piping, folks, is an environmental thing, which is why I told you this could be grouped into 2 different categories. Right now I'm grouping it into public land use controls, but it could be in the discussion of environmental. Straight piping is, it just goes into the yard. So if you literally have, a pipe that just runs into the yard, into a ditch, into a creek, into a hole, that would be straight piping. That is not an approved waste disposal system. That is an illegal waste disposal system. You're not allowed to just dump it into the yard or a creek.